people of the state of California versus Timothy Richard Heidecker.
Hi, Judge. Thank you, Judge, for doing this.
I can't think of many pieces of media in general that I appreciate more than the trial of Tim Heidecker. In fact, the word appreciate doesn't go nearly far enough. If you're unaware of this gem, I envy you for the chance to experience it for the first time, whether you decide to take it or not. If you don't, whatever this video's tiny place in the grand media landscape of YouTube commentaries and video essays nobody asked for, to me, it's at least catharsis to try my hand at explaining what's so great about this murder trial that I love so much. It remains valuable as a standalone piece of entertainment, albeit a rather inaccessible one, but to really understand what it is, you need to be aware of the foundation on which it's built. The Tim Heidecker in reference here is the Tim Heidecker from the universe of the web show On Cinema at the Cinema, and this trial represents a reckoning for his character, a dark culmination of an unfortunate series of events that have unfolded in that world. It's a hilarious, slow-burn character study in which the worst aspects of Tim's personality are revealed. Through a long series of testimonies and cross-examinations with almost all of the other characters from the series, we re-explore key moments from the history of the show as relevant topics for the defense or prosecution of Tim Heidecker. For the uninitiated, viewing this with the same fresh eyes as an impartial jury, this provides context for the details of the case and colors in a fascinating and bizarre story. For those who've been following the show, it's a trip through so many of the key elements we've seen on Cinema and related properties, contextualized in new ways with extremely high stakes. While rewatching the trial in order to prep for this breakdown, the thought that kept entering my mind was this thing should not exist. It shouldn't be possible. Every world-building brick that needed to be laid to get to this point, the absolute metric ton of improvisational and comedic talent needed to actually pull this thing off, the almost incomprehensible commitment to the bit, the realism with which it's produced. How could there be a 4-hour and 48-minute long video of a trial about a tragedy at an independent music festival in Apple Valley in which I'm this invested in the defendant and nearly everyone testifying, as well as intimately familiar with the case and everything that's led up to it, from the extenuating circumstances down to the minutiae of the interpersonal dynamics between those involved? And how in the world is it possible that very same video could be in my own personal contention for the funniest piece of comedy I've ever seen? It shouldn't be possible for a murder trial like this to fit so seamlessly within the world of this web show while produced in a way that feels incredibly real and serious, with an attention to detail so great that all the hired actors were lawyers in real life. Indulge me as I continue to gush about this for just a moment more because I feel it's really difficult to overstate how great it is. Within or beyond the confines of serial storytelling and comedy, this is an absolute marvel from both a creative and technical standpoint, built upon but not tied down by an over 6-year foundation of some of the most unique comedy ever put out and some of the best comedic characters ever created. Not only is it a satisfying and exciting payoff to all of this character building and storytelling, not only is it a celebration and re-examination of the lore of its own foundation, but it stands on its own as one of the single most creative and rewarding projects in comedy, regardless of any self-reference. This is a magnum opus, a deadly combination of inherently hilarious acting, perfect characterization, and a level of situational irony that can only possibly be achieved as a well-earned payoff to real creative geniuses running the longest joke on the internet. Lightning in a freaking bottle. For now, let's strip away the surrounding meta that elevates this trial to its great heights. I've heard tell a number of times of the trial being someone's introduction into the world of On Cinema and inspiring them to dive into the rest. So let's go with that as a thought exercise. Let's say you're completely unaware of both Tim Heidecker and On Cinema in general. You're scrolling through YouTube and you see a video called The Trial of Tim Heidecker. A curious mind or some kind of crazy person, you click on it and watch all 4 hours and 48 minutes of it. You'd see long drawn out proceedings, the judge being introduced, the general housekeeping of a courtroom procedure. You'd watch the opening statements from the prosecution and you'd hear a story of a man who distributed poisonous vaporizers at an EDM festival, causing the deaths of many people. Though the events described are ridiculous and bizarre and the story unfolding may fascinate or entertain you, you could potentially make it through almost an hour of this before noticing something is off. You may notice a brewing storm in the background. If you pay attention to the defendant, you'll see a variety of very abnormal reactions for someone in this position. That position being a man who's on trial for the death of 20 teenagers, by the way.
The suffering caused by Mr. Heidecker has devastated our community.
There's a clear array of emotions that does not at all include anything you'd associate with the way a caring, remorseful person in his position should be feeling. Instead, you see boredom, eye-rolling annoyance at the prosecution, informality and disrespect towards the proceedings as if to downplay the gravity of the situation, and complete detachment and distraction.
We have a fly in the room, Judge. Do we want to...
You'll even notice him visibly pleased and proud at the mention of his own name and his band.
DKR scene, empty bottle, over and over again, and I'll never forget that sound.
He's constantly being at least slightly disruptive, as a troubled child in class would be.
So what?
getting phone calls, playing with the objects on his table, whispering to his friends behind him in the audience. All of this painting a picture of a confused man that doesn't really grasp his circumstances. You see him getting gradually more frustrated with his representation.
Mr. Heidecker, please allow your counsel to speak for you. That's what he's being paid for.
Well, you're not doing your job.
All of this may seem bizarre, but many real-life cases would as well. And this first hour is so understated, realistic, and dry that it can and certainly has fooled people into thinking it's actually real. This is thanks to a big aspect of the trial's brilliance, its willingness to take its time in the name of absolute realism, to effectively lull you into believing its authenticity, to methodically and comprehensively lay the groundwork for what's to come. The insane details of the outlandish case are all presented so seriously, with no winking, nothing overtly comedic whatsoever. It's a very subtle, slow burn over the course of almost an hour. So, after all of this, when Tim comes in alone the next day without his lawyer and makes a big scene of getting rid of the other chair at his table, and then proceeds so incredibly inappropriately to open with a joke about the judge's name,
Judge Sismic, I feel like I'm on Wheel of Fortune, and we should say, can I buy a vowel? Because of the last name, but we're just a joke.
it's a release of pent-up silliness for which you've been thoroughly primed. Even knowing nothing about the context of this trial, and perhaps even still thinking it's real, you know so much at this point. You've heard in detail about the horrific events that took place, the gravity of Tim's situation, and the potential consequences of this verdict, 375 years in prison. You've watched his desire for control and attention build to the point that he's about to burst. You're accustomed to the no-nonsense atmosphere of the courtroom and how seriously this case is being taken. It's all played so straight and performed so well by all of the actors involved. It feels so real. Because of this, you're so well acquainted with the stakes and character implications that make it so much more inappropriate and so much more hilarious. This, to me, represents the overall comedic MO of the trial and why it's so brilliantly effective. Diligent and methodically paced setups to deliver higher payoffs, and an incredibly realistic and grounded approach to allow our characters' actions in court more comedic weight by comparison. The layers of this are multiplied tenfold when you extrapolate this concept out to the on-cinema universe as a whole. This trial is not only a medium switch from what we had seen up to this point in the universe of On Cinema, but a massive perspective switch as well. Since the characters are being filmed in a public court proceeding, they have no control over what we see. We're seeing them from the same neutral perspective as the theoretical public in their universe would be. The perspective switch reframes a lot of what we've already seen, or our feelings about these characters in interesting ways. Especially with Tim. It's hard to imagine a more negative light in which this character could be shown in, from the accusations against him and the evidence presented,
Having muscle spasms and foaming out of the mouth.
He ran over my friend's foot with a golf cart.
to the way he handles himself in these circumstances.
Look good with your music, it sucks.
It creates such an interestingly dark and conflicting viewpoint. The perspective shift also adds another layer of comedy that up until this point we hadn't gotten as much in the world of On Cinema. If you look at a show like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, so much of the comedy comes from the main characters out in the world acting like jackasses while completely normal, regular people interact with them and are affected by their insanity. Having these normal people there playing their roles so straight makes the world that these crazy characters inhabit feel more grounded in reality, which makes the insanity all the better for the contrast. The trial takes it to another level. It does this to an even greater extent and to greater effect, because the setting in which these ridiculous characters are placed is so humorless, so sterile, professional, solemn, and somber. The judge and prosecution are taking this case, their job, and their respect for the courtroom so seriously, and the stakes are so astronomically high for everyone involved. Up until this point, we didn't necessarily have a strong reference for how these characters are perceived in their world outside their circle. We've seen Tim and Gregg somehow continually failing up and continuing to make Oscar specials, TV shows, employing band members.
I go to my friend Manuel and I tell him, bro, finally you can quit that restaurant job that you hate because I found a guy that wants to play rock and roll and is down to pay.
But we never really get completely impartial opinions of their work or reactions to their behavior. This is the very first time we're seeing these characters interacting with regular people in their world. The closest example I'd probably bring up is from an episode of On Cinema in which Tim offers Gregg the opportunity to guest host and books a film professor named Larry Turman as a guest for him to interview. Here we have a sort of straight man, uninitiated, that we can see react to Gregg's nonsense.
They don't make a lot of bad movies, they make a lot of good movies. It's not like music where you have a lot of bad songs.
I don't know what to say about that.
I suppose there are examples of this on the Oscar specials as well, but I would make the argument that because these are all invited guests who know they're being filmed for an entertainment program, it's not the same kind of control value, so to speak, that the people involved with the trial are. Because it's the first piece of media that we've seen in which these characters are not controlling who's involved and what they say, we have that control value of regular serious people dealing with them. And we get this element of realism and grounding that elevates every interaction and every moment of insanity on display here.
Empty bottle, empty bottle. Number one download.
It's especially significant to those who have followed up until then, as if these characters left the On Cinema and Decker Matrix and we're finally seeing how they fare in the real world. The way these characters nonchalantly present the obscure and ridiculous concepts that are accepted as commonplace in their own bubbles as if they're normal and everyone should know what they're talking about is a hilarious way to highlight that.
Popcorn classics, W.C. Fields, 501 movies in 501 days.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Yep.
Beyond that, we're guided to re-examine the events of the show we've been watching and the morality of its characters, literally from the perspective of judge and jury. With Tim now representing himself,
You guys are smart and good looking. All you have to do is say innocent. You can be part of the foundation if you want.
one of the key elements of why this trial works so well really comes into the forefront. An absolutely brilliant comedic performance from Tim. It's over the top in the sense that his negative traits are so exaggerated to the point that if this were a real trial, it would probably make its way into the psychology textbooks and YouTube breakdowns. And yet, his performance is characteristically subtle. It's subtle in the sense that it never dips into parody. Tim's strength as an actor has always been coming from an authentic place. There's no winking here, no telegraphing to the audience ever. He stays completely rooted in the truth of his character, which grounds the performance despite often acting like a cartoonishly uncivilized and incompetent idiot.
Remember one thing. Innocent. Didn't do it. Was actually on stage with my laptops making my beats DKR during when this happened.
Because of this, his character feels like a real person that fits into this realistic, grounded, and inherently non-comedic courtroom setting without feeling out of place. This in turn allows for the outbursts and rants in such poor taste to have such enormous comedic weight while still feeling genuine and character-based.
No one's coming back. These kids aren't coming back. I got news for you. I got news for the parents.
It's seriously astounding that all of these actors were able to pull this off. I would consider it an amazing achievement in performance. Of course, there have been many courtroom movies, TV shows, courtroom parodies, etc., but this is a mostly unedited trial, essentially a 5-hour play with almost no scripted dialogue. It's an amazing environment for comedy because it allows for very long-form improvisation.
I had met Chris. And this is going to haunt me probably till the day I die. If anything should happen to me today, I want you to know, I want the world to know, I want San Bernardino, everybody to know. He said to me, you didn't do anything wrong today.
For the actors to play with silence, with anticipation, essentially with boredom. However, with that setup, there's an amazing burden on the actors to fill these 5 hours and make them convincing and entertaining. Tim's performance carries a lot of this weight, but so does everyone testifying, the judge and lawyers. Near perfect performances across the board.
Beautiful performance there.
The medium goes hand in hand with the style of improvisational acting because it allows for performances that wouldn't otherwise be possible. Take Tim's closing statements as just one example.
We have the China Connection.
It's almost 17 minutes long of pitch-perfect comedic acting and entirely improvised dialogue. It's genuinely hilarious the whole way through, whether you've watched the rest of this trial or not. And it's carried almost entirely by this incredible performance. Just imagine the stamina needed to carry a 17-minute improvised comedic monologue alone, and this is just one example in a 5-hour-long trial. I really can't think of many other actors that could do this as Tim did. This goes hand in hand with the hysterical way Tim mishandles his case. It's kind of the driving force of the trial, and it's the joke closest to its core, so I'm going to break down some examples. At this point in the trial, we have a perfect setup for comedy. Tim's earnest attempts but ultimate incompetence as a lawyer in this professional setting with such high stakes. It's consistently hilarious, especially when you consider the fact that he fired his lawyer in order to represent himself, despite the fact that he is not and never has been a lawyer. Again, it's Tim's inherently funny performance that makes all of this work.
Can count on Tim.
Count on Tim.
Yes, sir.
That's coming from Joe Estevez.
He stumbles through the trial misusing lawyerisms.
Now, I moved
Sarcasm
to
at the
defend
highest order.
He ineloquently stumbles over his words as he tries every possible tactic.
I dispute that evidence, for the record. I believe the evidence was manufactured.
Not understanding what objections are meant for.
Quite a tongue twister there.
Objection.
A tongue twister?
Is it a tongue
Overruled.
twister? Is it officially a tongue twister?
Overruled.
Using them frivolously to defend his own pride rather than his innocence.
DKR, which is a group nobody likes.
Objection.
And talking back and being generally disrespectful.
Judge, are you going to put this court in order or not?
No.
May I approach the bench?
No.
Why not?
Mr. Heidecker.
Mr. Sisnick. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
His blatant dishonesty is consistently thwarted.
Because you told me this when?
No.
This morning. Yeah. This morning.
This morning.
His incompetence in a courtroom setting alone is hilarious to watch, but it's always compounded with his other awful traits in the funniest ways. It's dark, but there's an emotional testimony of a grieving mother whose daughter perished from the vapes Tim handed out. She specifically points out that she holds Tim responsible. Now, take a look at Tim's response to this question from the prosecution.
If there was anything that you could say to her, what would that be?
Objection, speculative.
Not only is he misusing the phrase and objecting to something no lawyer ever would, it's also strong evidence of lack of empathy for her loss and his role in it. It brings me to another way in which Tim hilariously mishandles his own case. How oblivious he is to the awful way he's coming across. This ignorance is sold so convincingly in the performance. Tim is trying to present himself to the jury as a good person who cares about others, specifically the victims.
Christopher Delgado is important to me. They're all important to me. Let me just set that back, strike that. We're all important.
His actions and phrasing, however, always tell a different story. Take his indifference to the victims, for example, which is ironically most clear in his attempts to present the opposite.
Get this off.
When it's his chance to cross-examine that same grieving mother, he doesn't have any questions to ask her, but instead of just declining to question her out of respect, he goes up there and says this.
I am also the parent of a deceased child. We're in sort of this special club, I guess you could say, which, you know, is what it is.
In trying to show the jury he cares about the victims and their families, what he actually does is makes it all about himself and diminish the importance of the victims in the process. Tim's trust in the man that made the vapes, Dr. San, is precisely what led him to losing his own child 2 years prior. And his continued trust, despite San's obvious negligence, is what led to the loss of hers. So I can't think of a more tone-deaf, more ironically horrible thing to say in that moment. His performance, however, makes it clear that Tim is convinced he's doing a great job and coming across as genuine. His entire cross-examination consists solely of him talking about his own son, telling her that they're in a special club that is what it is, asking for a moment of silence, talking through that entire moment of silence.
I believe it was a moment of silence.
Yes.
And then this.
No further questions.
Not only has his lack of empathy and personal accountability been made plainly obvious to the jury, but in mentioning that his son also died at the hands of Dr. San, he reinforces his role in the tragedy and his prior knowledge of San's deadly malpractice.
Not a great plan.
In that very brief time at the podium, he proved all of this to the jury and walked away from it completely oblivious to what he had done.
Thank you, Mrs. Davis. All the best to you.
Sometimes it's his actions that contradict what he's saying. In his closing statements, Tim passionately argues his innocence as a man at the scene of the crime, and as he does, angrily slaps the photos of the deceased. What he's saying is one thing, but the optics of him hitting the pictures of the kids whose deaths he's allegedly responsible for is sending the complete opposite message. The extent to which Tim doesn't care about any of this is hammered home through the filming and the imagery of the video as well. Look at this one shot from day 2. There's a woman tearing up in the audience, obviously personally affected by this tragedy and likely there looking to see justice carried out for the loss of someone close to her. In the same shot in the foreground, we see Tim barely paying attention, rubbing his eyes, looking bored and annoyed. There's character to be studied and laughed at in every corner, in every moment of these almost 5 hours, because the performances and attention to detail are just that rich. Tim's actions in court consistently reinforce the very picture the prosecution paints of him in their examination of his character through his history and relationships. Look at this testimony of Mark Proksch, the celebrity impressionist often employed by, and in the past often abused by, Tim.
Very violent like Dexter.
The prosecution calls him to testify about Tim's character, showing him as an angry, abusive, and violent man. As Mark is asked whether Tim has abused him, Tim is staring at him angrily and blurts out a threat.
Watch it, Mark.
This right away confirms the alleged hostility, but Tim does not have the sense to hold it in.
Sit down. Sit down!
When he cross-examines, Tim again threatens him.
You would push me?
I would reconsider that answer if I were you.
His obvious frustration with Mark...
I'm getting a little frustrated with the witness right now, Mr. Judge.
...turns to full rage as he tries to attack the stand.
I'll fuck you up, Mark. Believe me. I'll fuck you up. Hold on. I'm out. I need 5. I need 5.
His whole goal was to convince the jury that he was not angry and abusive, and his struggles in trying to do that quickly turned into anger and abuse. The whole interaction says so much about Tim's character from the jury's perspective, but knowing the long history of Tim and Mark's relationship, there's so much added depth because that moment is so well earned.
I don't have any interest in hearing what he has to say.
Good. Okay.
There's been a well-established and well-documented animosity between these two characters that you've been following as it slowly grows. This fills in the gaps of Mark's fear and hesitance on the stand.
Proximity of the defendant to the witness in this case is intimidating the witness.
Yes.
As well as explains why Tim was so easily triggered by him. In the entire season of On Cinema leading up to this trial, Mark has been working as the waiter for Tim's Dine-In Theater.
If it smells like shit, it's bad wine. Get rid of it. Mark, ice cold.
Huh?
It's ice fucking cold. Leave the wine.
Do you want it back?
What?
When Tim is first arrested, Mark vents all of his problems with Tim live on the show, believing that Tim would not be returning from jail.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I don't think I'm going to miss him.
This leads into an episode in which Mark finds out Tim will be coming back on bail and watching the episode that he missed. You can feel Mark's absolute fear.
I haven't got a chance to see it yet, but as soon as I get out tomorrow, I'm going to check it out.
The next time we see Mark, he's taking the witness stand at Tim's trial. The deep backstories of the relationships these people have with Tim have been so thoroughly laid out for us that when they're on the stand testifying, we're so keenly aware of their feelings towards each other and the stakes they both have in the interaction and the outcome of the case.
The prosecution would like to call Gregg Turkington to the stand.
Hey guys.
At the very core of this universe is the relationship between Tim and Gregg. A major through line of the show and a staple at the core of their dynamic is Tim's constant desire to focus more and more on his own self-indulgent side projects and outside influences, and Gregg's insistence on keeping him focused on the web show and reviewing movies.
I was the movie expert, and he was becoming a hindrance because he would talk about these other things, like this band. There's no fans of DKR or Dakar. Nobody likes it.
For Gregg, the trial represents the fallout from these side projects, schemes, and alliances, or a consequence of the combination of behavior that's extraneous to the show. The behavior Gregg has always criticized Tim for. For Gregg, Dr. Sand is the mascot of Tim's distraction and the decline in quality of On Cinema.
You would see the ratings just plummet.
From Dr. Sand's very first introduction, Gregg made his feelings about him and his involvement with Tim in the show clear.
The show is On Cinema, not on alternative medicine.
The same goes for Dakar, Tim's band, which Gregg has always protested for similar reasons.
The thing that you've done that people love the most are these movie reviews. The thing that people don't like is Dakar and Dr. Sand.
The whole trial is a major I told you so moment for him, because the key factors in this trial were Tim's music career, Dr. Sand, and vaping. We know all this, so seeing Gregg in the audience the entire time, smiling at the moments where his long-held positions are validated, is such a funny detail considering the context. Him walking to take the stand for the first time in the trial, unable to contain his smile, ready to be sworn in for his I told you so moment, is just such a funny, well-earned payoff. His testimonies are some of the most hilarious scenes in the whole trial because of this deep backstory. It's obvious that Gregg himself does not have empathy for the victims either.
Did the formula to be safer, took out the dangerous chemicals?
It looks like you adjusted to be less safe because all these kids died.
And the feud between him and Tim is entirely personal. In the episode of On Cinema in which Tim's arrest is revealed, Gregg fills us in on the events almost cheerfully with a celebratory glass of wine in hand.
Kind of a somber occasion in some ways.
Despite the tragic events, he's solely focused on Tim no longer being there and him taking control of the show.
Former host of the show, Tim Heidecker. I bet he's watching more movies in prison than he ever did to review on the show.
Yeah, well, you know.
We know these are his feelings, so when he comes to testify against Tim, it's both hilarious and genuinely compelling to see this play out. He uses his platform to vent about every little thing that bothers him about Tim, while the judge and prosecution try to rein in his comments to what's relevant to the case. They have to do this because Gregg is not interested in the case, but rather his opportunity to speak freely about Tim.
Mr. Turkington, we really thank you for coming in and talking to us today.
Yeah, I wanted to also mention that
all of the particularities of Gregg's character, his desire to weave movie talk into every conversation.
Are you a medical expert? Do you have...
No, but I've seen lots of medical movies like Panic in Needle Park.
His insistence on his expertise and the popularity of his segments.
Do you have a degree from a major film university?
No, that would be a hindrance.
His snarky quips. These are already hilarious as we know them from the show, but are made funnier by how poorly suited they are for a courtroom setting, to the point that even Gregg is being reprimanded by the courtroom authorities. The character and relationship-driven humor doesn't just rely on these big obvious story beats or dramatic moments such as Tim trying to attack Mark. All of the world and character-building legwork that supports this trial allows for so many seemingly unimportant moments to become such big laughs. Just look at the way Tim calls Gregg to the stand.
I'd like to call who is in the courtroom at this hour. And his name, we've seen him before, I'd like to bring him back to the witness stand, is Gregg Turkington.
He's introducing him exactly as he would on an episode of On Cinema.
And my name is, my guest is Gregg Turkington.
It's one of many examples of these characters casually acting the only way they know how, unable to break from their habits and their dynamics that we know them for so well on the show, even in such a high-stakes situation. Being that he's testifying at a colleague's murder trial, Gregg so earnestly saying his regular catchphrase greeting as he sits down to testify makes me laugh out loud every time.
Hey guys.
Tim, still doing the casual, cool guy way he always talks when he's with his band members, even though he's on trial for murder, is so damn funny to me.
Axiom, my brother.
How you doing, man?
I'm hanging in.
Seeing Gregg sitting in the audience of a murder trial eating popcorn absolutely kills me. The world building and connectivity is so deep that an extra in the background of a few seconds of Decker is introduced as a witness in a way that makes sense. It's so deep that there's an actually kind of emotional moment where Tim has to confront his ex-wife.
Are you still in love with me?
No.
No further questions? Let me do 5.
It's so deep that Tim's song Empty Bottle is played in the courtroom for Tim to rock out to in a way that makes sense.
Let the court play Mr. Heidecker's Empty Bottle and let the jury decide.
No, I think it would be a nice tone shift in the courtroom to hear it.
It's amazing how much legwork was done to allow all of these amazing moments, jokes, Easter eggs, and payoffs. Not only that, but the same legwork allows for big reveals and new information that's cleverly made relevant to the case. We learned Tim's guitarist Axiom was actually the one who wrote his song Empty Bottle back in Italy before we met Tim. We learn about the way Tim treated his son when he was alive. This kind of interconnectivity and examination of its own lore makes this a really compelling watch beyond being hysterically funny. Speaking of which, a staple of On Cinema and its style in general is the long joke. Long-running and ever-compounding setups that deliver huge payoffs. The trial itself could be considered an example. It's the payoff to a long-running storyline that has escalated dramatically to the point of tragedy and insanity. When Dr. Sand was introduced as Tim's acupuncturist, I'm sure nobody except maybe Gregg could have predicted that years later that storyline would find its climax in Sand killing himself and Tim being on trial for murder. Some of the best examples of the series are found in this trial. It's not overtly jokey humor. I've heard some people claim that there are no jokes in it whatsoever. Sorry, but those people would be wrong. It may be harder to recognize when the setup doesn't come immediately before the punch, but as evidenced here, it may also make that payoff 10 times stronger if it comes 3 hours after the setup. Or better yet, 6 years. There's a perfect example of that, and this might be my absolute favorite part of the trial. There's a long-running joke on the show that has been snowballing since the very early days of On Cinema. It's been going since the days of the podcast, before the show of On Cinema ever even aired.
As this film did set them in San Francisco.
No, that was Star Trek 4.
But the one where they go back to San Francisco
of course.
is the second one.
Star Trek 4, and you just said it was Star Trek 2. It was Star Trek 4.
No, I had footage.
Shut up for a second.
I had footage from the street of San Francisco.
Shut up!
A contentious argument that has been a massive issue in their relationship for years. Tim will not let it go, and neither will Gregg. He takes it as a challenge to his reputation as a film expert, something which Tim only feigns respect for. It's a massive point of contention between these two men's egos. For Tim to find a way to make his own murder trial about proving Gregg wrong about this argument is just so perfect. And it's not just a quick scene. He takes a bunch of time asking Gregg on the stand about his film expertise and specifically the Star Trek question.
You're familiar with the Star Trek franchise?
The big surprise of the next day is Tim calling the actual writer and director of Star Trek 2 just to prove Gregg wrong. I don't know how else to say it, but that it's just one of the funniest things I've ever seen. With Tim still on trial for murder, by the way, questioning the director of Star Trek about where the various movies might take place.
A location in that film where...
San Francisco. They go to San Francisco.
While Gregg is sitting in the audience muttering in disagreement and finally outright arguing to the point that he's kicked out of the room.
I'm being vague.
No.
Star Trek 2.
Star Trek 2.
It would have been a great payoff to have them both in a room with the director of the movies regardless, but the fact that it's done as a part of a trial in which a guilty verdict would mean multiple life sentences, it's just perfect.
This fraud here, Gregg Turkington, as an expert witness, when his basic understanding of movies is there is none.
But even more perfect is that it's slowly, organically introduced in a way that makes sense from the perspective of the characters relative to the case. From the idea being introduced that a witness's testimony must be disregarded if any part of it is false, to Gregg testifying against Tim's character, to Tim interrogating Gregg about movies, a call Tim knows he could never resist.
Casablanca, Jaws, Gone with the Wind.
To Tim's summoning of Nicholas Meyer and Gregg's reaction to it. It's just a brilliantly plotted, multi-layered, and unbelievably long-running joke that is the type of thing that leaves me in such awe of this trial as a piece of art. Since this is On Cinema, the impact of the trial doesn't end there, and the ripple effects of this will shape the next years of the show. I won't get into them specifically in this video, maybe another, but the things that the trial leads to are some of my favorite moments in the series. And the way it's been handled since only strengthens the trial retroactively. Tim takes the absolute wrong lessons from this experience, confirming what a jury would have gathered from the way he behaved in the trial. He does not take any responsibility for what happened.
Your son is in hell, Delgado. That was his choice. It was all their choice. It had nothing to fucking do with it.
He does not have any remorse for what happened.
You were guilty.
No.
And then later you laughed about it, killing those kids.
He remains unwilling to denounce Dr. Sand, even praises him. Instead, he enjoyed playing lawyer so much that he stages a fake trial on the next Oscar special for fun, suggesting that this was an overall positive experience for him.
What do you think I am, Rosetti the Rat? What are you, Sismic?
He holds a bitter resentment for the judge and prosecution who sought only to bring justice to the families of the victims. We get an entire movie documenting his attempted retaliation. All of this, the brilliantly captivating and hysterically funny trial, all of the phenomenal world building and storytelling that led us to it, it's still a significant place in the On Cinema universe looking back on it after 6 years. A major factor I love so much about On Cinema is its great attention to detail and the realism with which everything is presented. Though what the characters themselves are doing, saying, and producing is often strange, surreal, or insane, the way it's all packaged and presented makes it feel like the people on the show you're watching are real people, interacting in the world, using social media, creating their own projects, just as we would expect from any public figure in the real world. Just as we would also expect that a public figure in real life who was allegedly responsible for a tragedy would face trial for his crimes, and that there would be footage of that trial. We'd also expect the footage of that trial would, through testimony and presentation of evidence, include examinations of that person's character, their history, and relevant interpersonal relationships. We'd also expect that this footage would not be filmed or presented in the same way as anything we've seen from that person's own pipeline. This being a public figure, we would see the aftermath and consequences of such an ordeal from their point of view moving forward. All of this to say, the trial of Tim Heidecker is done in such a realistic and faithful way to exactly how an event like this would play out, how it would be presented in our world, as well as exactly how we would imagine our characters handling it in theirs. It's produced to the point of realism that some people thought it was a legitimate case, which in itself always makes me laugh. Anyone interested enough to understand what it is will discover one of the most impressive high-concept comedy performances out there. Back in 2011, listening to the On Cinema podcast where they first argue about Star Trek, you'd never think that the events of this show could ever logically bring the stakes of that argument to a situation in which Tim's very life would depend on proving Gregg wrong about whether Star Trek II was the one that took place in San Francisco. But through the unique magic of this show, they did. So whether anyone agrees with me or not, I'm saying it. The Trial of Tim Heidecker is the best video on YouTube.